Here I am with my good friend Keiko. She was born in Japan. She has two sisters, one a twin, with whom she is very close. She worked in Japan as a nurse and met an American who was in Japan teaching English. They married and moved to the United States over 20 years ago. In her many years in America, she has lived in more regions than I have, including Hawaii, Florida, Maine, and now Washington State. In 2002, their son George was born. They chose this name for him because it sounds both American and Japanese. Joji is a common name in Japan. Our sons played on the same soccer team 12 years ago, and we have been friends ever since. Sadly, her husband passed away from cancer when George was just 7 years old. Needing to support her family, she returned to school to get her nursing degree, which was very difficult to do in English. She persevered after almost being cut from the program and graduated a few years ago. She then went to work at a nursing home facility. Many of her coworkers at the facility are also Asian immigrants. They call themselves the United Nations. She is continuing to go to school, and from my perspective seems to always be striving to improve herself, mentally and physically. She recently gained employment at a local hospital and is continuing to grow in her career there. Her son is a senior in high school and is a very successful athlete and student. Keiko is one of the hardest working people I know. She speaks English fairly well, but still struggles with writing in English. This makes school extra challenging for her, but she continues to study undeterred. She is an active, health-conscious, outgoing, and generous person. She is also the best deal finder I know when it comes to thrift store shopping and garage sales. When I compliment her on something she is wearing, she often proudly boasts at how cheap it was. She also loves learning for free on YouTube. Once, when she was having hip pain, and rather than go to a doctor, she instead found physical therapy exercises online and healed herself with her own regimen. She loves plants and often spontaneously gives them to me as gifts. She seems to consciously choose to prioritize the people she cares about over her ambition. Many times when we have gotten together, she will talk of the work she must do and then say something like, "But I must spend time with people. They are more important." I get the sense that this is the type of mantra that she uses to dispel the conflict she feels in regard to work. Culturally, we are very different, but we also share many of the same interests. We both share a love of hiking, and I like a good thrift store find just as much as she does. I am grateful for her friendship and the many walks and talks we have shared over the years. This concept of identity, as described in section 2.2 of the text, to me exemplifies the complexity of summarizing a culture. Keiko's life experiences are unique to her, and her identity has been formed by them just as uniquely. As we move forward in our discussion of the various aspects of Japanese culture in our region, we do so with anthropologist Edward T. Hall's key components of intercultural communication, as outlined on page 87, in mind. Specifically, that cultures should be compared from a local perspective. You don't have to know everything to know something. Experience counts, and perspectives can differ. This acculturation has, at times, led to a restructuring of sorts regarding who counts as Japanese. This very issue had to be addressed when the Cherry Blossom Japanese Beauty Pageant, held in Seattle in 1996, had to be canceled because they did not have enough candidates which met the strict Japanese ancestry criteria. The pageant has since shifted to include a broader group of mixed-race women, but still maintains its affiliation as a Japanese-American pageant rather than an Asian pageant. This demonstrates the Japanese community's value for a distinct cultural identity separate from that of the broader Asian American community. An article in Northwest Asian Weekly by Eleanor Lee summarizes the Cherry Blossom pageant in 2010. Lee clearly describes the shifting cultural identity within the Japanese community. In this article, Lee states, The four young ladies who completed this year are all earnest, accomplished, and good-natured. They are a testament to the Japanese American community in Seattle, even as that community becomes more and more loosely defined. What is notable about the pageant is that increasingly contestants are not full-blooded Japanese. Some of the contestants in recent years, on first meeting, would not be immediately recognized as Japanese. What is impressive is how the committee has allowed for the natural diversification of contestants. The young women who participate in this event are not defined by external parameters. Rather, they let their own experiences speak for themselves. My friend Keiko has connections in the broader Asian American community in Spokane. She has a different perspective of the many Asian cultural nuances. I would imagine many outsiders group Asians together collectively. In the past, she has spoken to me of feeling like she has more in common with the Koreans she knows than she does her Filipino acquaintances. Her closest friends here are those she shares a Japanese heritage with. Although, since working at the nursing home, her primary friend group could be better described as Asian rather than just strictly Japanese. Overall, it is important to understand that there are distinct similarities and differences among the differing Asian ethnicities. Japan as a nation is not very diverse at all. The national Japanese identity is very influential to those, especially first-generation immigrants to America. One cannot discuss the identity of Japanese Americans without acknowledging the cultural and at times divergent characteristics between generations. The following terms are used to describe the generations. The Issei, or great-grandparents, are the first generation. Nisei would be considered the grandparents or the American-born second generation. The Sansei, considered parents or the third generation. And the Yansei, the fourth generation. Many of the Issei, or first generation of Japanese Americans, immigrated to port cities in the western United States in the late 1800s to replace the Chinese laborers that were no longer able to work due to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Primarily, they worked as contract workers in lumber, railroad, fishing, and agriculture industries. Marriages were often arranged. Japanese men working in America would marry picture brides, or women they only knew from a photograph, bring them to America, and began raising the second generation of American-born Nisei. Over time and with great effort, they were able to move into other areas of business. By the 1940s, an estimated 7,000 lived in the Seattle area, running their own businesses as floral suppliers, owning 63% of the greenhouses, hotels, and apartments in Seattle. Due to the Alien Land Law, which was in place in the Washington State Constitution from 1889 to 1967, the Issei, who were not American citizens, were not allowed to own land. Many Issei farmers migrated to the Yakima Valley, where they were able to successfully farm on the harsh land of the Yakima Indian Reservation, as this was one of the few places where they were, for a time, allowed to lease and farm the land. Many of their children played in the Nisei Boys Baseball League, which was an important pastime which brought the Japanese community together often. By the 1940s, Japanese Americans had become integral in many communities throughout Washington. That drastically changed, however, when on December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in World War II, over 120,000 Japanese living in the United States during the war were imprisoned in internment camps, two-thirds of which were of the American-born Nisei generation. Approximately 10,000 Japanese Washington residents were forced to leave their homes, communities, and businesses behind, to live first at the Puyallup Fairgrounds, often residing in converted horse stables, then eventually sent to camps in Heart Mountain in Wyoming or Camp Minidoka in Idaho. They were allowed to bring one suitcase, and the rest of their possessions were to be stored or left with friends or neighbors. Most possessions left behind were never recovered. Not all Japanese were forced into internment, depending on where they lived. In eastern Washington, the Columbia River became the boundary line. Those west of the river were interned, and those east of the Columbia were not. For example, Japanese living in Kennewick had to go, but those living in Pasco did not. Those allowed to stay were restricted, however, from going near any infrastructure such as railroads or phone companies. Those not interned faced frequent racism and distrust as they tried to go about their daily lives. One person described this as a cold fury from those outside the Japanese community. The psychological, social, financial, and familial impacts of this injustice have immeasurably impacted Japanese culture in America through the generations in countless ways. The Nisei generation, already undergoing the inevitable acculturation and shift in ethnic identity that so often occurs with any immigrant population, were more surprised by the internment than their parents, who had more first-hand experience with discrimination. Prior to the war, many Nisei saw assimilation as a path to acceptance in the broader community. Many Nisei did not expect their rights as American citizens to be taken away. There was division within the Japanese community on how to respond to this treatment. Many joined the military as a way of proving their loyalty, while others refused to serve in protest of their rights being taken away. For some Nisei, internment became an opportunity to connect with their roots in a way they hadn't before, with time to study Japanese culture from the many first-generation Issei living in the camps. At the end of the war, those interned returned to their communities and began to rebuild their lives. Most did not discuss their painful experiences during the war with the next generation, the Sansei. Many continued to emphasize their Americanness over their Japanese ethnic identity as a way of coping with the lingering prejudices of those around them. Their lives and cultural identity were forever divided into a life before camp and a life after camp. This experience of silence about cultural trauma is not unique to Japanese Americans and is also noted by those who survived the Jewish Holocaust. Regardless of trauma, however, the Japanese values of loyalty, duty, endurance with dignity, acceptance of what cannot be changed, honor, and saving face likely also contributed to this stoicism. Those who lived through the challenges of racism, imprisonment, and loss during the war are described as being stronger for living through such tremendous struggle. Their future cultural identity was nonetheless forever changed by this grave injustice. Due to the silence of the Nisei generation, many Sansei lacked exposure to Japanese heritage and culture, while still experiencing rejection by the white community. The Sansei generation often felt both pushed towards assimilation and pulled toward the desire for a fuller understanding of their Japanese ethnicity. Similar to the identity crisis experienced by Gogol in the film The Namesake, it is common for children and grandchildren of immigrants to find themselves questioning their belonging. The Japanese internment seemed to accelerate this process for many Sansei. They both felt the impact of living with traditional Japanese values and expectations, while having little understanding of their origin due to the silence of their parents. While it is not uncommon for generations to move further from their ethnic culture as assimilation increases, just as is true for many European immigrants and their children, the book Japanese American Ethnicity: The Persistence of Community, authors Stephen Fujita and David O'Brien challenged these assumptions for the Japanese community living in America. The book argues that while second and third generation Japanese Americans are largely structurally assimilated into American society, they also often maintain a strong connection to their ethnic communities. It is possible that this has been achieved by the desire of the Sansei and later generations to connect to the past that was silenced by their parents' internment, resulting in a revival of sorts in more recent years. Locally, the Japanese ethnic community is largely connected through religion. Many Japanese attend church services at Highland Park United Methodist, which was established as a Japanese mission church over 100 years ago, or they attend the Spokane Buddhist Temple, which is located on the South Hill. My friend Keiko mentioned earlier says she attends Highland Park about 70% for the community and about 30% for the worship. She has also mentioned that it was much easier to find opportunities to connect with fellow Japanese while she lived in Hawaii, as there is a much larger Japanese population in that region. Spokane is not without multiple ties to Japanese culture, however, through organizations such as the Mukagawa Fort Wright Institute, which is an extension campus of the Mukagawa Women's University in Spokane's sister city, Nishinomiya, Japan, and in the Nishinomiya Tsutakawa Japanese Garden, which was completed in 1974 and enjoyed by many in Manitou Park. The gardens are named for Ed Tsutakawa, who was instrumental in the formation of both institutions. Ed himself was interned at Camp Minidoka during the war, where he met his wife, Hide. He called Spokane the greatest place and founded the Sister City Partnership with Nishinomiya, where he spent time as a child. Ed's passion to connect the two cultures is a testament to the importance of passing down his heritage to countless generations, and Spokane is better for it. Just as my friend Keiko's experience does not mirror the multi-generational experience of past Japanese immigrants, especially of those who arrived before World War II, no Japanese individual can be lumped into one category regardless of what generation they are. Broadly speaking, Japanese perspective and perceptions are largely influenced by how an individual identifies as Japanese. As with many immigrant cultures, there are often disparities in culture and identity experienced by different generations. Some in the Japanese American community have perhaps held more firmly to many significant aspects of their culture as a way of bridging the lost years during and directly following internment. Others, perhaps, due to the silence of the Nisei generation, have little connection to the history of the Japanese American generations before them, or like Keiko, are first generation themselves. It should also be noted that interracial marriage rates are higher in the Japanese population than in that of any other Asian group. Therefore, many Japanese, like Keiko's son George, are multiracial and identify with several cultures.
Self-disclosure is the process of deliberately delivering information about oneself that is significant and not otherwise known, part of sharing information to communicate with others. In spite of the positive changes that have started to take place in my daily life, I still long for my life on Vashon, free. It is always hardest at night when I was alone with my thoughts, listening to the night sounds that had become so familiar. I often tossed in bed, unable to sleep, my stomach aching and my feet cold. Shame and anger kept crowding in as we faced the daily indignities of being imprisoned. These thoughts and feelings threatened to overwhelm me. I was now convinced America will never accept me as a full-fledged American. Here I am in a self-contained community that didn't feel like a community at all. More and more I felt as if I were in prison. We had a hospital, a post office, a warehouse, offices, and schools. But it was all surrounded by barbed wire fence and guard towers. The only way out was through the guarded main entrance. There was no place to be alone or to have a private conversation with anyone. Each block was set up according to an identical plan. A block had 14 barracks, a mess hall, a recreation hall, laundry room, and separate bathrooms and shower rooms for men and women. There were approximately 260 people living in our block. Hone is what you really want to say, your true feelings. Tatamai is what you are supposed to say in public, your public stance. Self concept is what we perceive ourselves to be, aspects of image and esteem. How we see ourselves and how we feel about ourselves influences how we communicate with others. Looking for context from others is known as the looking glass self, to gain insight into our identity. Each time that I think about my father and what he did in 1940, my appreciation and understanding of the incident continues to grow. In fact, it makes me very emotional to realize that his deed saved thousands of lives and that I had the opportunity to be part of it. I am proud that my father had the courage to do the right thing. Yet his superiors in the Japanese government did not agree. The years after my family left were difficult ones. We were imprisoned for 18 months in a Soviet internment camp, and when we finally returned to Japan, my father was asked to resign from his diplomatic service. After holding several different jobs, my father joined an export company where he worked until his retirement in 1976. My father did remain concerned about the fate of the refugees and at one point left his address at the Israel embassy in Japan. Finally, in the 1960s, he started hearing from survivors, many of whom had kept their visas and considered the worn pieces of paper familial treasures. Mariah Dasu, Spokane ni Sandimasu. This is a brief introduction. My name is Mariah. I live in Spokane. These are ways to develop trust with people in the Japanese culture in a verbal way. Remember, trust and communication takes time. Pointing to the nose is a way to identify if we are talking about ourselves. Alternatively, waving a hand in front of the face is a way to say, not me. If you hit your fist with your palm one time in an initial interaction with someone you're just meeting, this is a way to say, I'm listening. Soto and uchi, outside and inside. Uchi soto is the Japanese language distinction between in groups and out groups. This distinction between groups is a fundamental part of Japanese social custom and even directly reflected in Japanese language itself. This is an important Japanese concept to understand Japanese language and therefore better improve our verbal communications with Japanese culture.
Personal space, a concept from Chapter 6. Chapter 6 states that personal space is the bubble of space surrounding each individual. Proxemics, or personal space, is very important and respected in Japanese culture. The distance they keep between each other is about 2 to 3 feet apart. The distance also depends on who they are communicating with. Personal space, or Pasanuru Suppesu, is a highly valued luxury due to the norms of the culture. Japanese generally live with more than just immediate family members in small quarters with paper-thin walls. It was also common in communities back in the day to bathe together in sento baths, so seeing your neighbor naked wasn't a big deal. Today, more and more Japanese residents now have their own baths. Living in our region is often seen as a luxury because of the larger personal spaces and having access to private bathrooms. Another reason personal space is considered a luxury is because of traveling on cram-packed transportation systems such as trains or subways, as this is the most common mode of transportation in Japan. Wearing masks even before the pandemic is a form of personal space for a lot of Japanese people, so they don't mind it. It gives them more of a sense of personal space away from other people. I imagine in the pandemic that Japanese people are less annoyed with having to wear masks versus Americans. Eye contact, a concept from Chapter 6. Chapter 6 states, eye contact is a gaze that engages the listener. In the Japanese culture, people are taught not to maintain eye contact with others because too much eye contact is considered disrespectful or rude. Japanese traditionally lower their eyes when speaking to a superior as a gesture of respect. Japanese people have a very hard time adjusting to the Western tradition of maintaining strong eye contact in a conversation because it goes against everything that they have been taught. Well-acclimated Japanese Americans know when to use eye contact and when not to, depending on whom they are communicating with. Some Japanese will even use anti-shyness training videos to train themselves how to look people in the eyes. In our region, Japanese will avoid eye contact with American strangers and use eye contact if they know you personally. Haptics, a concept from Chapter 6. Chapter 6 states, haptics is touch and communication interaction. Japanese are known for how respectful their gestures are. Bowing to others in Japan shows respect toward the other person, especially to strangers. Japanese are very sensitive when it comes to haptics. Unlike Western countries, hugging in public and shaking hands are both not a part of their traditional practices. They involve touch only with their friends, families, and their partners. Women from Spokane Mukugawa University go out shopping together and hold hands. This is for a sense of protection and closeness to whom they are familiar with. Japanese in our region take up less space with their bodies physically compared to Americans with how they present and hold themselves. They tend to have placed their hands in front of themselves with a smaller stance, while Americans are often seen with their hands on their hips with a wider stance. Cold cultures, a concept from Chapter 6. Chapter 6 states, cold cultures are cultures associated with low frequency and intensity of affective displays. Typically, Japanese show little affect display, response, or reaction when listening or responding, yet feel just as strongly about an issue. Affect displays for Americans provide insight into our emotional temperature and may communicate the degree at which we are aroused, engaged, or passionate about an issue. Japanese are culturally bound to refrain from showing emotion, so like eye contact, this can be challenging to express. Japanese in our region allow themselves to show more affect display than more traditional Japanese people because it is accepted here. Microgroup, a concept from Chapter 7. Chapter 7 states, microgroups are a small independent group that has a link, affiliation, or association with a larger group. Unlike Seattle, Spokane's small Japanese population, or microgroups, demand a higher level of integration with a larger community. Many Japanese families have settled in the South Perry neighborhood here in Spokane, making them a number that makes up the overall population here in Spokane. Japanese women attending Spokane's Mukagawa University create their own microgroup as a small affiliation to Japanese much larger Mukagawa University. Charity, a concept from Chapter 7. Chapter 7 states that charity is the act of donating time, money, or resources to alleviate a social ill. The Nishinomiya Tuskawawa Japanese Gardens were completed in 1974 and symbolize the friendship and love for Spokane and its sister city, Nishinomiya, Japan. Nagao Sakurai designed the park along with 166 other parks around the world. He was struck by a stroke while the park was still under construction, leaving the left side of his body paralyzed. School children in Spokane sent him letters and pictures showing him charity and help him feel less homesick. He continued to oversee the site, and his son helped him finish the park. Over time, different features have been added and taken away from the park. Spokane businessmen and women have donated plants, money, and time to the upkeep of the park since then. Social contract, a concept from Chapter 7. Chapter 7 states that a social contract is the idea that we benefit from the society into which we are born and live, and in turn we are responsible for following the rules and observing the customs of that society and protecting, defending, and promoting it. Spokane's Highland Park Methodist Church offers more than just religious services. English language courses held at the church have appealed to Japanese families looking to become more American. A course was offered back in 1912 that sought to help Japanese brides adapt to American culture by emphasizing Christianity and political loyalty. As more Japanese began attending the church, Japanese language lessons and clubs were formed to ensure that newer generations did not forget their roots. Groupthink, a concept from Chapter 7. Chapter 7 states, groupthink is the tendency to accept the group's ideas and actions in spite of individual concerns. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese-owned businesses faced boycotts by many in Spokane. Spokane Japanese American veterans were refused admittance to local veterans associations, including the Veterans of Foreign Wars Association. In the 1940s, being Japanese was associated by many in Spokane as a display of anti-Americanism. Japanese recalled the animosity of other immigrant groups like the Chinese, who wore I Am Chinese buttons to separate themselves from the Japanese. These are great examples of groupthink because you can see how easily people, even other immigrant groups, that feel pressured by the norm, crumbled and accepted Spokane's general ideas of Japanese Americans and conformed to them.
According to Chapter 8 of our text, virtual communication is defined as the representational interaction between individuals, groups, and communities within the online environment.
Virtual communication is very important for the women at Mukagawa University. Without virtual communication, they wouldn't be able to contact their friends and family back home, saying as though it is an abroad program. One thing about virtual communication in Japanese culture is that it kind of strips away all of the etiquette and context clues we use when we're talking face to face, which is very important in Japanese communication. They communicate a lot of the time non-verbally through tone of voice and gestures and stuff like that. And online, it's hard to communicate those pieces of context. So communicating virtually through video conferencing is the most used practice of virtual communication because it provides a little bit of that face-to-face context that you don't normally get over virtual communication.
According to Chapter 8 of our text, affiliation involves the representation of membership, including the display of common symbols, images, values, or words through close proximity or presence.
Affiliation is a huge thing for the Mukagawa University. There's a culture center for students to go in and see a little bit of the normal things they see back home, some culturally significant things. They have kimonos on display and stuff like that. Also, the Japanese language is commonly spoke on Mukagawa University, and many of their classes and information online is in Japanese for their students. There's many bilingual people there for interpretation and stuff like that.
Gender depiction and portrayal can be defined as the evident roles, expectations, and freedoms portrayed in society that are attached to a given gender.
The Mukagawa Women's University breaks gender depiction stereotypes in Japanese culture. In Japanese culture, there are very specific expectations for women in the home, at work, and in society. Many women are supposed to have children after marriage, quit work, and are treated differently under law. There are more expectations and less freedoms for women in Japan, and most women don't go to higher education schools. Women's sexual health is very hard to access in Japanese culture, and stereotypically there is a huge gender inequity in Japanese culture, unlike what we see in our Western culture.
According to Chapter 9 of our text, wellness is the dynamic or ever-changing, fluctuating state of being. Wellness involves perspective about balance and the big picture.
Wellness is a very important aspect at the Mukagawa Women's University. Being abroad is very difficult for your mental health as well as physical health because it's just a completely different surrounding, different environment. And your health is necessary for participating in the abroad activities brought on in the university. At the university, it's clearly stated that health includes mental as well as physical health, which is a great concept to have. In current Japanese culture, one thing that is very evident that comes across as a way of health is wearing masks. Even before the pandemic started, wearing masks is extremely popular in Japanese culture as kind of just keeping your personal distance and your personal space and not spreading any germs to anybody.
Chapter 9 of our text defines cultural context as the high or low context norms, power, distance, gender, and social/individual norms.
Some sociologists call Japan a high context culture. Compared to our culture, it would be considered a high context culture. High context cultures are homogenous and well established. There's much communication going on non-verbally through subtle gestures or facial expressions or tone of voice. That's usually how people in Japan communicate. They pick up on those little pieces of communication that typically in Western cultures we don't. We just kind of say what we want to say. Japanese culture is very group oriented. They're taught in school to be interdependent rather than independent. It's a very group oriented community, And personal life questions are kind of seemed as an invasion of privacy. People usually keep their personal matters to themselves and don't engage in conversations like that where it's more self-oriented rather than group-oriented.
Chapter 9 of our text defines cultural background as religious sentiment, privacy, treatment, and service expectations, beliefs, values, and attitudes.
There are many aspects to the cultural background in Japanese culture, some of which include thinking of others, respecting your elders, knowing your role, and working in groups. Like I said, interdependence over independence is widely taught in schools. And one of the biggest goals of Japanese culture is harmony, to have harmony in everything they do. Um, Individuals act deliberately and with restraint to protect their self-worth and peer perception. Your self-worth and how your peers perceive you is very important in Japanese culture and kind of establishes your status. The most common religion belief system in Japanese culture is Buddhism.